I need a wife, and you need strong sons, the giant mountain man declared to the lonely obese teacher. I need a wife, and you need strong sons. The words hit the one-room schoolhouse like a hammer on winter glass. Oil light flickered across rows of empty benches, chalk dust hanging in the air like frost. Adelaide Thornton, 31, round-cheeked, ink-stained, the plain blue of her dress dark against the cold, looked up from a stack of copybooks and found a shadow filling her doorway, too broad for the frame. Magnus Eriksson ducked inside and shut the wind out with his palm. Snow hissed along the sill. He stood a head and more above the lintel, bare skin coat streaming melt water, hair and beard the pale gold of straw under frost. The smell of spruce and iron and weather came with him, a thing older than the town. Addie's first instinct was to stand. Her second was to sit back down, because her knees had gone untrustworthy. She fixed her spectacles with fingers inked from long practice and said, as calmly as she could manage, "School's closed on Saturdays, Mr. Eriksson." He didn't blink. "Then we won't be disturbed." Outside, Pinewood's main street rattled faintly. Wagon chains, a far door slammed, voices that always dropped when she passed. Old laughter, the kind that measured a woman by the inches she didn't hide. In here, the only sound was the low, steady rasp of his breath and the ticking stove. "I'm afraid you've mistaken your errand," Addie said, heat rising to her face though the room was cold. "I teach letters and sums, not courtship." "This isn't courtship," he said, and the word landed without apology. "It's a proposal. You are a woman who keeps her word and her work. I am a man with land, meat, and room for a family. You want children. I want heirs who won't break under wind. We would both gain." The sentence should have cut. Instead, it pressed, heavy and blunt, against something hollow inside her that had ached for years. She swallowed it down. "You mistake me again," she said, but softer. "I have a life here. I won't be bartered like salt." Magnus's gaze did not waver. "I don't trade in people. I choose them. I have watched you. You stand when men try to make you small. You never speak cruelty to a child. You work after dark and before day. This is why I came to you." He reached into his coat and set a small wrapped parcel on her desk. Brown paper, twine, a sprig of pine tucked under the knot. She stared. He didn't touch it again. "7 days," he said. "I'll return. If you say no, I won't trouble you. If you say yes, we marry before the thaw takes the trail." The lamp guttered. The wind clawed once at the door. Addie found her voice at last, thin but steady. "And if I ask for something other than sons and strong backs? If I ask for respect?" His answer was immediate. "Then I tell you the truth. I don't know how to be pretty with words, but I know how to keep a vow." He opened the door. Winter rushed in and shouldered him out. When it closed, the little school was suddenly too quiet. Addie sat very still in the hush he'd left behind, heart drumming against the walls of her ribs, the parcel staring up like a question she'd been dodging for 5 long years. The next morning, Pinewood woke beneath a gray sky heavy with snow. The town was small, one crooked street, 2 saloons, a church, a mercantile, and Addie Thornton's schoolhouse, perched at the edge like a last good thought someone had before winter came. Inside, Addie was trying, and failing, to focus on her lessons. Her students' voices were bright, laughter echoing against timber walls, but her mind kept circling back to the words that refused to fade. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons." It had been the strangest proposal she'd ever heard. Direct, practical, almost absurd. And yet, it hadn't been cruel. Magnus Eriksson hadn't sneered the way some men did when they said her name. He hadn't looked at her the way others did, with amusement or pity. He had looked at her like a farmer studying land, steady, respectful, certain of its worth. Still, the audacity of it burned. Addie was 31, and she knew what people whispered, that she'd missed her chance, that her curves and her books and her stubborn tongue had cost her the kind of future most women expected. She told herself she didn't care. Her classroom was her world, her students, her family. But sometimes, in the quiet after the children went home, when the only sounds were the tick of the stove and the creak of her chair, she would let herself imagine a home filled not just with lessons and ink, but with voices that called her Mama. Now that man's words had cracked open a door she'd worked years to keep closed. 3 days later, Mrs. Clara Henderson stopped by the school with a basket of bread and gossip. "You look distracted, dear," she said, settling her weight into the visitor's chair. "Is something wrong?" Addie hesitated, then confessed the whole story. Magnus Eriksson's visit, his proposal, his reasoning. When she finished, Mrs. Henderson didn't gasp or laugh as Addie had expected. Instead, the widow folded her hands over the basket and said quietly, "He's not mad, you know. Just alone. My husband traded furs with him once. Said he's a good man, only rough as bark." "A good man doesn't walk into a woman's schoolhouse and offer marriage like a business deal," Addie said, voice sharp with pride she wasn't sure she still felt. Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened. Maybe he doesn't know any other way to ask. Men like that, they build with their hands, not their words. And sometimes, dear, the quiet ones keep their promises best. That night, Addie took the small parcel Magnus had left and unwrapped it by lamplight. Inside was a single carved wooden bird, delicate, hand-smoothed, wings spread in flight. It must have taken days to shape. She ran her fingers along the grain and felt her anger loosen. It wasn't a gift of romance. It was a symbol, simple, honest, steady, just like the man who had left it. Sunday came with a blizzard, the kind that made the whole town hold its breath. Addie stayed in her quarters behind the school, listening to the wind beat against the shutters. Her thoughts tangled. Philadelphia, the parents she'd buried, the life she'd built from nothing. And then Magnus, standing like a mountain in her doorway, offering her not flattery but partnership. Could respect become affection? Could affection become love? When the storm broke at dawn, Addie made her decision. A week to the hour, Magnus returned. Snow still clung to his coat, his beard frosted with ice, but his eyes were clear as river glass. He removed his hat as he entered, a gesture that looked almost courtly on a man built for wilderness. Addie stood beside her desk, heart steady now. "Mr. Eriksson," she said, "I've considered your proposal, but before I answer, I have conditions." He inclined his head. "Speak." She lifted her chin. "I'll continue teaching until I choose to stop. I'll be your wife, not your servant. And I expect to be treated as your equal in all things." Magnus studied her, and something like a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "I wouldn't have asked a lesser woman. You have my word." "Then," Addie said softly, "you have my answer." He nodded once, no cheering, no embrace, only quiet certainty. Good. I'll see Reverend Wright tomorrow. That evening, when she closed the schoolhouse for the last time as Miss Thornton, Addie stepped outside and looked toward the white line of mountains that crowned the horizon. Somewhere up there was the cabin of the man she'd just agreed to marry, the man who had called her strong. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine a life that wasn't only hers. The morning after their wedding, the town of Pinewood gathered along Main Street to watch something they'd never seen before. Miss Adelaide Thornton, the school teacher who had spent 5 years teaching other people's children, leaving town as a bride. The ceremony had been small, simple, and nearly silent. Reverend Wright spoke the vows. Mrs. Henderson dabbed her eyes. A handful of Addie's students brought wildflowers from the frozen edge of the forest. There had been no music, no laughter, only the low murmur of voices and the rustle of Magnus's heavy coat as he slipped a ring onto her trembling hand. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Magnus had done nothing theatrical. He'd simply bowed his head and whispered, "Tack, Adelaide. Thank you." Now, as the couple mounted his wagon, pulled by 2 massive draft horses, the townsfolk watched in uneasy awe. The giant mountain man, broad as a barn door, sat beside the round, bookish teacher who had once corrected their children's grammar. They didn't look like a love story, but they felt like one waiting to be written. The first day's ride wound through pine and shadow. The path climbed higher with every mile, narrowing to a trail carved by deer and time. The air turned sharper, cleaner. Addie's cheeks flushed pink against the cold, her breath a white ribbon in the air. Magnus drove in silence, his gloved hands steady on the reins. When she shivered, he stopped the wagon without a word, rummaged through the back, and handed her a fur-lined cloak that smelled faintly of cedar. "You'll need this," he said. She took it hesitantly. "What about you?" He shrugged. "The cold's a friend. It keeps lesser men away." That made her smile, despite herself. They camped that night beside a half-frozen creek. Magnus built a fire in silence, his movements precise and sure. Gather, strike, flame, life. Addie sat nearby, hands folded in her lap, feeling strangely out of place. When the stew was ready, he handed her a tin bowl. "Eat first," he said simply. "I'll eat after." She blinked. "You don't have to." "I do." She ate quietly, the food rich and smoky. It warmed more than her stomach. When she handed the bowl back, he said without looking up, "You're thinking of home." "I suppose I am," she admitted, "but I'm not sure what that word means anymore." Magnus stared into the fire. "Home isn't where you're from. It's where the work feels worth doing." His tone was flat, but something in it made her throat tighten. On the second day, the wind rose, snow fell thick, erasing the trail, and Addie grew frightened. "Magnus, how will you find the way?" He didn't answer at first. He just leaned forward, reading the land like a page. "The mountain shows you," he said finally, "if you stop trying to command it." The storm worsened. Addie's hands numbed, her lips went pale. Magnus stopped the horses, lifted her from the wagon with effortless strength, and carried her under a stand of pines. His body heat radiated through his coat like a furnace. "You'll freeze," she protested weakly. He wrapped his fur around her shoulders, his voice rough but gentle. "Not while I'm here." For the first time, Addie felt what safety truly meant. Not comfort, but certainty. By the time they reached the cabin on Timber Ridge, the snow had stopped. The sun broke through in ribbons of gold, lighting the log walls that Magnus had built with his own hands. Smoke drifted from the chimney. A pair of goats bleated near the pen. The world felt distant, untouched. Addie stepped down and stared. "It's enormous." Magnus almost smiled. "It needed to be. I built it for a family." Inside, the air was warm and wood-scented. A great stone hearth dominated the main room. Shelves of tools and books lined the walls. Addie ran her fingers over the smooth wooden table. Everything here had been shaped by his hands, rough, practical, but built to last. "This is your home," she said softly. "Ours?" he corrected. The word settled between them like an oath. That night, Addie sat near the fire, the crackle of burning pine filling the silence. Magnus was mending a harness, his hands moving with patient precision. She watched the firelight dance across his face, the hard lines, the quiet focus, and realized something unexpected. He didn't look dangerous anymore. He looked lonely. "Magnus," she said quietly, "why did you leave Norway?" He paused, then spoke without looking up. "I buried too many winters there. My father, my brothers. The sea took the rest. I wanted a place that didn't remember their names." Addie swallowed. "And did you find it?" He met her gaze then, the light catching in his pale blue eyes. "Not until today." Her heart stuttered. She looked back to the fire, afraid to breathe too loud. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees, not cold now, but like a lullaby that belonged only to them. The days that followed were quiet, but full. For the first time in years, Addie woke not to the clang of the school bell or the sound of children's chatter, but to the soft crackle of fire and the faint scent of pine smoke drifting through the cabin rafters. Each morning, Magnus rose before dawn. She would hear the creak of the floorboards, the heavy step of his boots, the sound of the door opening to the cold. By the time she stirred from bed, coffee was already heating over the stove and the fire burned steady. He never said much, only nodded when she entered. But somehow that silence was its own form of greeting. Addie soon learned the rhythm of mountain life. While Magnus chopped wood or checked the traps he'd set along the ridge, she tended to the goats, gathered eggs, and learned to bake bread using coarse ground flour. He milled himself. She found small ways to soften the cabin, hanging curtains from old flour sacks, sewing cushions from scraps of cloth, arranging dried flowers near the window. Magnus never commented, but Addie often caught him pausing to look, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes, before he went back to his work. One morning, Addie burned the biscuits. The smell filled the cabin before she could throw them out, and she felt a surge of panic. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I wasn't paying attention." Magnus lifted one of the blackened rounds, bit into it, chewed thoughtfully, and said, "Still better than anything I've made." Addie blinked. "You're mocking me." He shook his head. "No, I mean it." Then, after a pause, "You've made this place smell alive." The compliment, plain, clumsy, but sincere, warmed her more than the fire ever could. Over time, their partnership settled into a comfortable dance. When Magnus repaired a roof beam, Addie steadied the ladder. When she read aloud from her books by the fire, he listened in silence, brow furrowed as though the words themselves were another kind of work. Sometimes, when she laughed, he looked at her in quiet wonder, like a man watching snow fall for the first time. One night, while mending a tear in his coat, she pricked her finger. Magnus immediately took her hand, inspecting the tiny bead of blood on her skin. His calloused thumb brushed it away gently. "It's nothing," she murmured, but her voice trembled. His eyes met hers, steady, intent. "Everything that hurts you is something." Neither spoke after that, but the air between them had changed. Heavy, fragile, electric. Spring crept down from the peaks, softening the edges of the snow. The streams began to sing again, and the valley burst with green. Addie worked in the garden while Magnus built a fence around it, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, muscles rippling with each strike of the hammer. She caught herself staring more than once. When he noticed, he only smiled faintly and said, "The sun suits you." That night she could not sleep. She sat by the fire, the room glowing amber, listening to the soft breath of wind through the eaves. Magnus entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed her one and sat across from her. "I was wrong," he said after a moment. "About what?" "When I said I didn't believe in love." His voice was low, rough as gravel, but honest. "I thought it was a word men used to make promises they didn't intend to keep. But since you came, the mountain feels different. The silence isn't so heavy." Addie looked down at her tea. Her hands shook slightly. "Magnus?" He reached across the table, his hand covering hers, broad, scarred, warm. "You don't have to say anything. I only wanted you to know." She looked up at him, and in that moment, with the firelight flickering between them and the scent of pine in the air, she realized she had fallen in love with him too, not suddenly, but slowly, like the snow melting into spring. That night, when she rose to leave the table, he caught her hand gently. "Adelaide?" She turned, heart pounding. He stood, towering over her but uncertain, in a way she'd never seen. "I made a promise to wait until you were ready, but I need to know. Are you?" She hesitated only a moment before whispering, "Yes." He stepped closer, his breath warm against her skin, and kissed her. Slow, reverent, like a man who had forgotten how to be gentle but was learning again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hymn. From that night on, the cabin was no longer just a refuge. It was a home. Their laughter filled its corners. Their footsteps echoed through its halls. Addie began to hum while she cooked. Magnus began to carve small wooden animals, birds, flowers, leaving them on her bedside table as silent tokens of affection. They worked side by side through the long mountain days, their love growing like the wildflowers that push through the thawing soil, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. By midsummer, life on Timber Ridge had settled into something close to peace. The garden was green and full. The goats had birthed 2 kids. The air carried the scent of pine sap and sun-warmed earth. Magnus hunted and trapped. Addie tended the home and taught him to read by lamplight each evening. At night, she sometimes woke to find him sitting by the window, bare feet on the floorboards, staring into the dark beyond the pines. When she asked what he was thinking, he would only say, "Counting ghosts." She never pressed him. She had learned that silence, too, was a kind of conversation. But ghosts, once named, do not stay buried for long. One afternoon, as Addie walked down the trail toward the creek with a basket of laundry, she heard the distant sound of hooves. When she turned, she saw 2 riders climbing the ridge, men in long coats, their horses slick with dust. She froze. No one came this far up the mountain. "Magnus!" she called, dropping the basket. Within seconds he was beside her, rifle in hand, his face turning to stone. "Stay behind me." The men dismounted. The older one, tall, with a scar running down his jaw, raised a hand. "Easy there, friend. Name's Marshal Henry Cole. We're looking for a man goes by Magnus Erickson. Norwegian. Big fella." Magnus's jaw tightened. "You found him?" The marshal's eyes flicked over Addie, then back to him. "There's a warrant out of Cheyenne. Says you deserted a federal contract 10 years back, one that cost the government a fortune. You left before the job was done and disappeared into the hills. They've been looking a long time." Addie's heart stuttered. "Magnus?" He didn't look at her. "That contract was a lie. They wanted us to clear land that wasn't theirs, take it from settlers, burn their homes. I refused." The marshal sighed. "Maybe so, but the law says you ran." Addie stepped forward. "He didn't run. He refused to do something wrong." Cole's eyes softened. "Ma'am, that may be, but I still have orders." Magnus stood silent for a long moment. Then, without warning, he unbuckled his belt, set his rifle on the ground, and held out his hands. "Then do it clean!" Addie's voice broke. "No." He turned to her, eyes steady. "It's all right, Adelaide. You built a home here. Keep it. I'll come back." The marshal bound his wrists with rope. Addie watched them ride away down the ridge, the sun glinting on the steel of the handcuffs. When the sound of hooves faded, the silence hit her like a blow. For 3 days she didn't eat. She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire staring at the chair where Magnus used to sit, the book he'd left half open on the table. Then, on the 4th morning, she stood up, tied her hair back, and saddled the horse. She rode down the mountain, her heart pounding with every mile, until she reached Cheyenne. The courthouse was crowded when she burst in, her dress covered in dust, her face flushed from wind and fury. The judge looked up in surprise. "Ma'am, I'm here for Magnus Erickson," she said, her voice shaking. "He's not a criminal. He's a man of honor, and I can prove it." She laid a folded paper on the table. The contract Magnus had kept hidden in a drawer, one she'd found the night before she left. She had read every line, every signature. It authorized the removal of settlers who had built homes on disputed land, by force if necessary. The judge frowned. "You're saying he was ordered to commit violence against civilians?" "Yes," Addie said fiercely. "And he refused. He walked away from money, from security, from everything, because it was wrong. That's not desertion. That's integrity." There was a long silence. Then the judge leaned back and said quietly, "Release him." When Magnus walked out of the holding cell, dirty and tired but free, Addie ran to him without hesitation. He caught her in his arms, lifting her clear off the ground. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw tears in his eyes. "I told you I'd come back," he said softly. She laughed through her tears. "And I told you I'd never let you go alone." They returned to Timber Ridge together, the sun setting behind them in bands of gold. That night, sitting before the fire, Addie asked him, "Why didn't you tell me?" Magnus stared into the flames. "Because I didn't want my past to stain what we built." She touched his hand. "The only thing your past has done is show me the kind of man you are." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You've given me something I thought I'd buried with my brothers. "What's that?" she whispered. "Peace." But peace in the mountains was always temporary. Late that summer, a telegram arrived at the trading post in town. It bore the seal of a railroad company, the same one that had once funded the contract Magnus refused. They were expanding north. The surveyors had found iron on Timber Ridge, and the company wanted the land. Autumn came early to Timber Ridge. The air grew sharp. The leaves flamed gold and crimson, and for the first time since the war between right and wrong had nearly taken Magnus from her, Addie felt peace settle over the cabin again. But it didn't last. One evening, as they sat at the table, Addie reading aloud while Magnus carved a small wooden horse for one of the neighbor's children, a knock shook the door. Magnus rose slowly. He never liked knocks after sundown. On the other side stood two men in tailored coats, their boots too polished for mountain mud. Behind them, a third man waited with a rolled parchment and a revolver at his belt. "Mr. Magnus Erickson?" the taller one asked smoothly. "I'm Edward Harland, representing the Union Western Railroad Company. This ridge belongs to the Federal Expansion Zone now. We're laying track by spring. You'll need to vacate within 30 days. Magnus's expression didn't change. "The land's deeded to me. I built this place with my hands." The man smiled thinly. "Your claim is unregistered under the new survey. You can take the company's offer, $200, or we'll remove you by force. It's progress, Mr. Erickson. You can't stop it." Addie stepped forward before Magnus could speak. "You call theft progress?" The man's eyes slid over her dismissively. "Ma'am, this isn't your concern." Magnus's voice dropped like a hammer. "It is now. She's my wife." The air froze between them. Harland cleared his throat. "You have 30 days." He tipped his hat and turned. The gunman lingered a second too long, meeting Magnus's gaze, then smirked and spat into the dirt before following. When they were gone, Addie's hands trembled. "Magnus, what will we do?" He stared out the window toward the ridge that crowned their valley. "We'll stand like the mountain stands." For the next week, Magnus prepared as if for war. He reinforced the cabin doors, dug a defensive trench behind the barn, and checked the rifle that had not seen battle since his capture years before. Addie helped as best she could, packing supplies, storing food, writing letters to the sheriff in Pinewood for legal aid. No answer came. On the 12th night, the sound of hooves woke her. Magnus was already at the door, rifle in hand. Through the trees, torches flickered. Half a dozen men, maybe more, coming up the path. Harland's men. Addie grabbed his arm. "Magnus, please, don't fight them alone." He looked down at her, the firelight cutting across his scarred face. "I'm not alone." He kissed her forehead, then stepped outside. The first torch landed in the snow beside the porch. Magnus raised his rifle and fired, a single shot that shattered the torch and plunged half the ridge into darkness. "Leave now!" he roared. "This land isn't yours." A voice answered from below. "You think you can stop the railroad, mountain man? You can't fight progress." Magnus chambered another round. "Progress doesn't burn homes. Men do." Gunfire cracked. Addie ducked behind the doorframe, heart pounding. Bullets splintered wood, shattered glass. Magnus moved like a storm, firing, reloading, firing again. Each shot drove the attackers back another step down the slope. Shadow, their wolfhound, lunged from the dark, snarling, scattering the horses. Then silence. The last man dropped his gun and ran. When the smoke cleared, Addie rushed outside. Magnus was standing near the fence line, his breath steaming in the cold air. His coat was torn, blood dark on his sleeve. "Magnus!" she cried, running to him. He waved her off gently. "It's nothing." She pressed her hands to the wound anyway, tears streaking her cheeks. "You could have been killed." He met her gaze, his voice quiet but steady. "Then I'd die knowing I kept what was ours." She shook her head, voice trembling. "This fight will never end. They'll send more men." Magnus nodded. "Then we'll be ready. But we won't run." He turned toward the ridge where the torches had burned out and the stars were beginning to pierce the sky. "No man can own the mountain, Adelaide. It lets us stay only if we respect it. That's what they'll never understand." The next morning, the sheriff from Pinewood arrived with the marshal who had once arrested Magnus. They'd ridden through the night after intercepting Addie's final letter. When they saw the wreckage, spent casings, trampled snow, and the wounded mountain man standing guard, they took in the truth at once. The sheriff spat into the dirt. "Harlan's men will be facing a judge by sunrise." Marshal Cole added quietly, "You've got friends in town now, Erickson. Seems word about what you did spread fast." Addie gripped Magnus's hand. For the first time, the tension in his shoulders eased. Winter came early that year, and when the first snow blanketed Timber Ridge, no one came to take their land again. The railroad changed its route, carving west instead of through the mountain. Progress had bent around them. That night, by the fire, Addie placed her hand over Magnus's heart and whispered, "You kept your promise." He smiled faintly. "I told you I'd build something that lasts." She leaned against him, listening to the steady beat beneath her ear, the heartbeat of a man who had chosen principle over comfort, love over solitude, and a home over the whole restless world. 10 years passed on Timber Ridge like the turning of slow golden seasons. What had once been a lonely cabin on a cold mountain had grown into something far greater, a home that pulsed with laughter, warmth, and the sweet chaos of life. Magnus and Addie had filled it with the sound of children's voices. 4 boys, Eric, Thomas, Lars, and Peter, tall, broad-shouldered, and kind-eyed like their father, and a girl, little Clara, with her mother's soft brown curls and stubborn spirit. The Ericksons, as the townsfolk now called them, had become legend in Pinewood, the mountain family who had stood against the railroad and won. Each morning, Addie still woke before the dawn. She'd light the lamp, pour coffee into a chipped blue mug, and step outside to watch the first light strike the peaks. The air smelled of pine and frost, just as it had that first winter when she'd been frightened and uncertain. But now there was peace in her chest, the quiet, grounded kind that comes from a life built honestly, from the ground up. Inside, the cabin hummed with life. Magnus's axe rang in rhythm out back as he split wood. Clara's laughter echoed from the chicken coop. The boys wrestled in the yard, shouting about who could climb the ridge the fastest. Addie smiled to herself and whispered, This is what I dreamed of." By mid-morning, children from the valley arrived, carrying books and slate boards. Addie had built a small schoolhouse beside the cabin, a bright structure with wide windows and a bell that Magnus had forged himself. She taught not just reading and sums, but the stories of those who'd come west before them, stories of courage and conscience. Sometimes Magnus sat at the back of the room, his great frame filling a chair too small for him, listening quietly while Addie spoke. When the younger children faltered with their spelling, he'd grin and rumble, "Don't give up. Your teacher never does." The children adored him, the giant of Timber Ridge who carved toys from pine wood and told stories of Norway and snowstorms and wolves that howled at the edge of the firelight. One evening, after the last of the students had gone, Addie found Magnus sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the mountains. His beard was streaked with silver now, his face lined by time and weather, but his eyes, those clear glacier blue eyes, still held that same steady light. She sat beside him, their shoulders touching, and for a long while they simply watched the world fade from gold to violet. Finally, she said softly, "Do you remember what you told me the first day we met?" Magnus's lips curved. "I need a wife, and you need strong sons." She laughed, shaking her head. "It was the most unromantic thing anyone had ever said to me." "And yet," he murmured, turning to her, "here we are. You have 5 strong children, and I have the only woman I ever truly needed." Addie smiled, eyes shining. "I didn't just need sons, Magnus. I needed a man who saw me, who built with me, who stayed." He reached out, his rough fingers tracing the edge of her cheek. "And you did. You built something that will outlast us both." That night, when the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Addie sat writing by lamplight, her journal, as she always did at the end of each season. Her words were simple but full. "Once I thought love was meant to arrive with thunder, grand, sweeping, and fierce. But love, I've learned, grows like a mountain, slowly, layer upon layer, until one day you look up and realize it has become your world." She closed the book and glanced at Magnus, who had dozed in his chair by the hearth, his face softened by the glow. Addie whispered into the quiet, "Thank you for choosing me." And though he was half asleep, Magnus smiled and murmured, "I didn't choose you, Adelaide. The mountain did." The children were grown, scattered across the frontier. A teacher, a blacksmith, a sheriff, a builder, and a healer. The cabin on Timber Ridge remained, its logs seasoned by decades of wind and weather. When the snow fell, smoke still curled from its chimney, a sign to travelers that there was warmth waiting there. Sometimes, folks passing through would stop to ask about the story. The teacher who came west alone, the giant who asked her to marry him without a word of love, and how together they carved a life from wilderness. And every time, someone from the valley would smile and point up toward the ridge and say, "They proved something out there. That love doesn't need fine words, just 2 people stubborn enough to build through every storm." The mountain held their story, quiet and eternal. Every story leaves something behind, a whisper, a warmth, a truth that outlives the people who carried it. Addie and Magnus's tale isn't about perfection or passion at first sight. It's about choosing to stay when life turns cold. It's about 2 lonely souls who stopped waiting for the world to be kind and built kindness with their own hands. When Magnus said, "I need a wife, and you need strong sons," it sounded blunt, almost harsh. But what he truly meant was, "I want a life with you, built on something real." And that's what they did, not through wealth or beauty or promises, but through work, respect, and quiet love that deepened like roots beneath the snow. Love, real love, isn't loud. It doesn't always arrive wrapped in poetry. Sometimes it's a man chopping wood so you'll stay warm. Sometimes it's a woman waiting by the firelight because she believes he'll return. That's the kind of love that lasts. So wherever you're listening from, whether you're in a city full of lights or a small town where the nights are still, remember this: love doesn't always find you in the way stories promise. Sometimes it waits at the edge of a mountain, wearing a bearskin coat, speaking plain words that change everything. And if you believe that love like that still exists, stay a while, because the next story might just be yours.